Imagine this scenario. Your wife invites her ex to dinner at your home, spends the evening laughing at his jokes, reminiscing about their glory days, and then drops the bombshell. I don't know why we ever broke up. The audacity, right? That's exactly what Ben experienced. But instead of losing his temper, he pulled off a move no one anticipated, locking her and her ex out of the house, flipping the narrative in the most stunning way possible. Before we delve into this gripping story, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you're into captivating tales like this one, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out. Ben sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring his coffee, watching the steam curl upward. Jessica had been acting distant for weeks, and he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his chest. She wasn't the same woman he had married 6 years ago. There were the unexplained late nights at work, the way she kept her phone glued to her side, always face down. Even her laughter, which used to fill their home with warmth, seemed to have vanished. "Is everything all right?" Ben had asked one evening as Jessica scrolled through her phone on the couch. Her reply was short, almost mechanical. "Yeah, just busy with work," she mumbled without glancing up. The excuses piled up like bricks in a wall, creating a barrier he couldn't see past. A week earlier, he'd caught her standing outside late at night, speaking quietly into her phone. When he asked who she was talking to, she waved it off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just a friend from college," she said, brushing past him as though the conversation didn't matter. Ben told himself not to overthink it. Jessica wasn't the type to keep secrets. At least she hadn't been before. But as days turned into weeks, he couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. It felt like she was slipping away, no matter how hard he tried to hold on. Then, during a quiet dinner one Wednesday night, Jessica dropped a bombshell that left Ben reeling. "Travis is back in town," she said casually, stabbing at her salad. Ben blinked. "Travis? You mean your ex, Travis?" Jessica glanced up, a slight smirk tugging at her lips. "Yeah. We ran into each other a few weeks ago. I thought it'd be nice to catch up." Ben's stomach churned. Travis wasn't just a name, it was a specter from Jessica's past that he had no desire to revisit. "Catch up?" he repeated carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. She nodded as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "I invited him over for dinner this Friday." Her eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "It's just dinner." The words cut deep. "Just dinner." Ben forced a smile, gripping his plate a little tighter. "Sure," he said finally, though everything inside him protested. Jessica tilted her head, studying him. "It's not a big deal, Ben. Don't make it weird." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Of course not." But as she turned her attention back to her meal, he couldn't ignore the faint, self-satisfied smirk on her face. It wasn't a look that said, "I love you." It was a look that whispered, "I know exactly what I'm doing." The next 2 days crawled by, each moment more torturous than the last. Jessica seemed more animated than she had in months, humming as she cooked and constantly texting. Her face lit up in a way Ben hadn't seen in years. On Friday evening, Ben watched her get ready. Her reflection in the mirror was radiant. She wore a deep red dress he hadn't seen in ages, one that hugged her curves in all the right places. Her perfume lingered in the air, sharp and alluring. She spent nearly an hour on her hair and painted her lips a bold crimson, a color that made her look like a stranger. "You look nice," Ben said from the doorway. Jessica glanced at him through the mirror, her smile poised and distant. "Thanks," she replied, turning back to adjust an earring. As Ben walked to the living room, unease clawed at his chest. The tension in the house was suffocating, like the calm before a storm. He heard the soft click of her heels on the hardwood floor behind him, and took a deep breath, trying to calm the pounding in his chest. It was just dinner, he reminded himself, but deep down he knew it was so much more. When the doorbell rang, the sharp chime echoed through the house. Jessica's face lit up with an excitement that twisted something inside Ben. She glanced at him briefly, as if checking his reaction, before walking to the door with a deliberate sway in her step. When the door swung open, there stood Travis, exactly as Ben had imagined, tall, broad-shouldered, and oozing smug confidence. His tailored blazer and charming grin only added to the air of superiority that grated on Ben's nerves. "Jess!" Travis exclaimed, pulling her into a hug that felt far too intimate. "It's so great to see you!" Jessica laughed, a laugh Ben hadn't heard in months, and leaned into the hug, her hand lingering on Travis's shoulder. "It's good to see you too," she replied, her voice light and melodic. Ben stood stiffly in the background, feeling like a guest in his own home. Travis approached him with an overly friendly smile. "Ben," he said, extending a hand. Ben shook it firmly. "Travis," he replied, his tone neutral but tight. As the evening wore on, Travis effortlessly took command of the conversation. He recounted tales of his professional achievements, his world travels, and his latest luxury purchases. Jessica hung on his every word, laughing too loudly at his jokes and reminiscing about their shared college days in a way that made Ben's skin crawl. Ben sat silently, his emotions simmering just beneath the surface. Each laugh, each lingering glance between Jessica and Travis was another twist of the knife. He clenched his fork tightly, his knuckles whitening, as he wondered, how did it come to this? As Travis sat across the table, basking in Jessica's admiration, Ben felt a knot tightening in his stomach. He lifted his glass of wine, taking a long sip, letting the bitterness anchor him. "You've got a nice setup here, Ben," Travis said, his tone teetering on condescending. "It's cozy, like I mentioned earlier. Refreshing to see someone keeping things simple." Ben's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I'm satisfied with what we have," he replied, his tone calm, but with an unmistakable edge. Jessica laughed, the sound slightly strained. "Oh, Ben's always been practical. He prefers to keep life uncomplicated." The subtle dig wasn't lost on Ben. He carefully set his fork down, his knuckles whitening as he clasped his hands beneath the table. He glanced at Jessica, who was too absorbed in Travis to notice the tension building beside her. The weight on Ben's chest grew heavier with each passing moment, but he swallowed his frustration, determined not to react. At least, not yet. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, masking his feelings with a tight, icy smile. "Let them think I'm just sitting here, taking it," he thought. For now. As the evening unfolded, Jessica's behavior shifted from reserved admiration to outright flirtation. Her laughter became louder, her gestures exaggerated, as though she were performing for Travis. Ben watched her place a hand on Travis's arm, her fingers lingering as she leaned closer. "Do you remember sneaking into the library after hours?" she asked, her tone drenched in nostalgia. Her eyes sparkled as they fixed on Travis, entirely ignoring Ben. Travis chuckled, soaking in the attention. "How could I forget? We nearly got kicked out of school. You were such a bad influence," he teased, his grin widening. Jessica playfully swatted his arm, the touch lingering a moment too long. "Me? You were the one with all the wild ideas," she said, her voice light and melodic. Ben's stomach churned as he observed the scene. Jessica's body language radiated intimacy. Her knees pointed toward Travis, her fingers tracing the rim of her wineglass as she hung on every word he said. It was as though the life they had built together had evaporated, replaced by the shadow of her past. "Those were the days," Jessica sighed wistfully. "Life felt so carefree back then. It's funny how things change, isn't it?" Her gaze locked onto Travis, her smile soft and nostalgic. Travis smirked, nodding. "Some things change, but others don't," he said, his words loaded with implication. Ben's grip on his glass tightened, the muscles in his jaw clenching, but he remained silent. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thicker as Jessica and Travis exchanged words and glances like daggers aimed straight at him. Inside, Ben's emotions swirled like a storm. Each laugh Jessica gave Travis, each casual touch, added fuel to the fire smoldering in his chest. He sat stiffly, his hands balled into fists beneath the table. What is happening here? He wondered, his thoughts racing. He felt like a stranger in his own home, reduced to a bystander in their intimate reunion. Jessica's voice rang in his ears. "It's just dinner." But there was nothing casual about it. This wasn't catching up. This was rekindling something she had no business entertaining. Ben forced himself to breathe deeply, willing himself not to lose control. His nails bit into his palms as he clenched his fists tighter, the discomfort grounding him in the moment. Jessica's laughter interrupted his thoughts, grating and sharp. He glanced up to see her brushing a piece of lint from Travis's sleeve, the casual intimacy of the gesture making Ben's blood boil. This isn't right, he thought, the realization settling heavily in his chest. The weight of betrayal pressed on him, suffocating and inescapable. Yet he swallowed his pride and pain, refusing to let them see how deeply it hurt him. Ben stared at his untouched plate, his appetite long gone. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. Not yet, he told himself, but soon. The conversation took a turn, and Jessica leaned back in her chair, her expression wistful. Her voice softened, deliberate in its delivery. "You know," she began, her gaze locked on Travis, "I don't know why we ever broke up." The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Ben froze, his fork suspended midair as the weight of her statement crashed into him. His chest tightened, a mix of disbelief and fury threatening to consume him. Jessica's tone was casual, almost careless, as if she hadn't just shattered the thin veneer of their evening. Travis chuckled awkwardly, glancing sideways at Ben, though the satisfied smirk on his face said it all. Jessica, oblivious or indifferent to the tension, sipped her wine, her gaze never leaving Travis. Ben's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood, the sound slicing through the suffocating silence. He fixed a cold stare on Travis. "I'm stepping outside," he said, his voice tight and strained. Without waiting for a response, Ben turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his movements deliberate and restrained. He shoved his hands into his pockets, clenching them tightly to steady himself. Jessica and Travis exchanged uneasy glances as the door slammed shut behind him, cutting off anything Jessica might have said. Outside, the crisp night air hit Ben like a slap. He inhaled deeply, the cold biting his lungs but doing little to quell the storm raging within him. He paced the porch, his fists clenching and unclenching, as Jessica's words echoed in his mind like a cruel refrain. "I don't know why we ever broke up, Travis." The casual cruelty of her remark burned, each syllable carving deeper into his already fragile trust. How did we get here? He wondered bitterly, gripping the porch railing until his knuckles turned white. The woman he had married, the one he had built a life with, now felt like a stranger, sitting inside with a man who had no place in their lives. The wind whistled through the trees, its chill mirroring the barren emptiness Ben felt inside. He thought about the sacrifices he had made for their relationship, the love and effort he had poured into their life together, and now it all seemed reduced to ashes. Yet, amid the swirling emotions, one thought crystallized. This isn't just about Travis. It's about her. Jessica had allowed this to happen. She had chosen to let it happen. Ben exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the icy air. A grim determination took hold. He wouldn't lash out in rage or crumble beneath the weight of her betrayal. No, this wasn't the time for emotion. It was a time for action. Flicking his cigarette into the snow, Ben turned back to the house. His jaw set, his eyes cold, he stepped inside, already setting his plan into motion. The locksmith's voice was calm and professional, though edged with curiosity. "You need all the locks changed?" Ben gave a curt nod, gesturing toward the house. "Every lock, front, back, garage. I want them all replaced." The locksmith raised an eyebrow but didn't pry further. He got to work immediately, his movements precise and efficient. The metallic clink of tools echoed through the quiet house, contrasting with the muffled voices coming from the guest room upstairs. Ben leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching as the old locks were removed one by one. Each twist of the screwdriver felt like a small triumph, a tangible reclaiming of his space and his self-respect. The new locks gleamed in the soft glow of the nearby lamp, their sharp edges reflecting the light. When the locksmith moved to the back door, Ben followed closely, offering a steadying hand as the man adjusted the latch. Finally, the deadbolt on the front door clicked into place with a satisfying finality. "Done," the locksmith said, wiping his hands on a rag. He held out a small cluster of keys. "Here are the new ones." Ben took them, the cold metal heavy in his palm. "Thanks," he said simply, his voice steady. He slid the keys into his pocket, walking the locksmith to his van and watching as it disappeared down the street. Standing in the entryway, Ben ran his fingers over the newly installed deadbolt, testing it to ensure it was secure. The house was silent now, save for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. A sense of accomplishment settled over him, a feeling of control he hadn't felt in weeks. He turned off the lights, the new keys still clutched in his hand, and headed to bed. Morning couldn't come soon enough. Morning sunlight seeped through the blinds as Ben sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee. The faint creak of footsteps upstairs signaled that Jessica and Travis were awake. He remained calm, his expression unreadable, hiding the events of the night before beneath a practiced stillness. Jessica was the first to come downstairs, her hair tousled, her steps casual. She wore one of Ben's oversized shirts, an irony that wasn't lost on him. She yawned, stretching lazily as she entered the kitchen. "Morning," she said, her voice light and unbothered. Ben returned a faint smile. "Morning," he replied evenly, taking another sip of coffee. Moments later, Travis sauntered in, his presence filling the room with an air of smug ease. His shirt was wrinkled, his grin overly confident as he nodded at Ben. "Smells good in here," he remarked, gesturing toward the coffee pot. Ben didn't respond, instead gesturing silently toward the counter. Jessica poured herself a cup, leaning against the counter with a contented sigh. Both of them seemed far too comfortable, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Setting his mug down, Ben rose, his movements deliberate. "So," he began, his tone casual. "What's on the agenda for today?" Jessica exchanged a quick glance with Travis, a small smile playing at her lips. "We were thinking of grabbing lunch, maybe catching up a bit more," she said, her voice overly nonchalant. Ben nodded thoughtfully, his expression unreadable. "Sounds nice," he said smoothly. "You two deserve to enjoy yourselves." Jessica hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. "You're okay with that?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Of course," Ben replied, offering a small, calm smile. "Why wouldn't I be?" His easy tone seemed to disarm her, and she nodded slowly. Emboldened, Travis clapped a hand on Ben's shoulder. "Appreciate that, man. Not everyone would be so understanding." Ben's smile didn't falter. "I just want everyone to be happy," he said evenly. Reaching for his keys, Ben walked to the door and held it open. Jessica and Travis exchanged puzzled glances as they followed. The moment felt charged, something unspoken hanging in the air. Jessica paused, turning to Ben with a quizzical expression. "You're coming back, right?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Ben's smile shifted, growing colder and sharper. "Nope," he said simply, "but neither are you." Before they could respond, he stepped outside, locking the door behind him with a decisive click. The sound reverberated in the quiet morning air, leaving Jessica and Travis standing on the porch in stunned silence. Jessica jiggled the door handle, her confusion giving way to irritation. "Ben," she called, her voice rising. The door's locked. Inside, Ben stood just out of sight, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't reply, letting the silence speak for him. Jessica's frustration boiled over. She pounded on the door with her fist. "Ben, this isn't funny! Open the door!" she demanded, her voice sharp. Travis shifted awkwardly beside her, his confidence fading. "Is this some kind of joke?" he muttered, stepping closer to the door. "Ben, come on, man. Let's talk." Jessica's irritation quickly turned to panic. Her breaths quickened as she banged harder. "Ben, open the door now!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The cold air bit at her skin, and she wrapped her arms around herself, glancing nervously at Travis. "I don't think he's joking," Travis said quietly, his unease clear in his tone. Inside, Ben poured himself another cup of coffee, his movements slow and deliberate. He leaned against the counter, savoring the warmth of the mug in his hands. Through the window, he watched their panic build. Jessica pounded on the door with increasing urgency, her voice rising in desperation. "Ben, please!" she shouted, her breath visible in the crisp air. "This isn't what you think." Ben took a slow sip of coffee, his calm demeanor unshaken. He didn't need to argue or shout. His silence spoke louder than words. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of control, of balance. Jessica's frantic knocking faded as her energy waned, replaced by pleading. "Please, Ben, let me explain," she begged, her voice trembling. "I wasn't thinking straight. I made a mistake." Ben set down his mug and approached the door, his steps measured. He didn't open it but spoke through the barrier, his tone steady and cold. "You made your choices, Jessica," he said. "Now you get to live with them." The locksmith's tone was firm, though tinged with curiosity. "You want every lock replaced?" Ben nodded sharply, motioning toward the house. "Every single one, front, back, and garage. I don't want a single old lock left." The locksmith hesitated briefly, but then shrugged, getting straight to work. His hands moved with precision, each tool clicking against the metal as he removed the existing locks. The faint sounds of his work echoed in the otherwise quiet house, a stark contrast to the muffled voices from upstairs. Ben leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching as the locksmith worked. Every turn of the screwdriver felt like a small step toward reclaiming his space and dignity. The new locks gleamed under the dim light, their polished surfaces reflecting the glow. As the locksmith adjusted the latch on the back door, Ben stepped closer, offering silent assistance. When the deadbolt on the front door finally clicked into place, it brought a sense of closure, like the final note of a long, discordant tune. "All set," the locksmith said, wiping his hands on a cloth. He handed Ben a small set of keys. "Here you go." Ben accepted them, the cool metal weighty in his palm. Standing alone in the entryway, Ben let his hand rest briefly on the newly installed deadbolt, testing its strength. The house was eerily quiet now, save for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. A sense of finality settled over him, along with an unexpected calm. He turned off the lights and headed to bed, the new keys still clutched firmly in his hand. Tomorrow would bring clarity. Morning light streamed through the windows as Ben sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand. Upstairs, he heard the faint creak of footsteps signaling that Jessica and Travis were awake. His expression remained neutral, his demeanor calm and composed as he waited. Jessica descended first, her hair tousled, her movements unhurried. She wore one of Ben's oversized shirts, a small, bitter irony that wasn't lost on him. Yawning, she stretched casually before entering the kitchen. "Morning," she said breezily, as if everything were perfectly normal. Ben met her with a faint smile. "Morning," he replied evenly, taking another sip from his mug. Travis followed shortly, his presence loud, despite his silence. His shirt was wrinkled, his movements slow and overly familiar. "Smells good in here," he remarked, grinning too broadly as he nodded at Ben. Ben simply gestured toward the coffee pot without responding, his silence a stark contrast to the growing unease in the room. Jessica poured herself a cup, leaning against the counter with an air of ease that grated on Ben's nerves. Both seemed entirely too comfortable, oblivious to the shift in power. Setting his mug down, Ben stood. His movements were deliberate, his tone casual. "So," he began, "what's on the agenda for today?" Jessica exchanged a glance with Travis, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes before she answered. "We were thinking of grabbing lunch, maybe catching up a little more," she said with a feigned nonchalance. Ben nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "Sounds like a nice plan," he replied, his voice smooth. "You both deserve to enjoy yourselves." Jessica's brow furrowed slightly, a hint of doubt creeping into her tone. "You're okay with that?" she asked cautiously. "Of course," Ben answered with a small, unreadable smile. "Why wouldn't I be?" Jessica seemed momentarily disarmed, nodding slowly. Travis, emboldened by Ben's calm demeanor, clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Appreciate that, man," he said. "Not everyone would be so understanding." Ben's smile didn't falter. "I just want everyone to be happy," he said simply. Reaching for his keys, Ben walked to the door, holding it open as Jessica and Travis followed. The moment felt heavy, a charged silence hanging in the air. Jessica hesitated, turning back toward Ben with a curious expression. "You're coming back, right?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Ben's smile shifted, colder and sharper. "No," he said evenly, "and neither are you." Before they could respond, he stepped outside, locking the door behind him. The resounding click of the new locks echoed in the still morning air, leaving Jessica and Travis stranded on the porch, their confusion quickly morphing into panic. Jessica rattled the door handle, her confusion turning to frustration. "Ben!" she called out, her voice rising. "It's locked!" Inside, Ben leaned casually against the counter, a small smirk tugging at his lips. He said nothing, letting the silence deepen. Jessica's frustration gave way to anger. She pounded on the door, her voice sharp. "Ben, this isn't funny. Open up!" Beside her, Travis shifted awkwardly, his confidence visibly shaken. "Is this some kind of joke?" he muttered, glancing at Jessica. "Ben, come on. Let's talk." Jessica's panic grew. "Ben, open the door now!" she shouted, her voice cracking. She turned to Travis, her tone desperate. "You're not leaving, are you?" Travis looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, Jess," he said cautiously. "This isn't my fight. I didn't sign up for this." Jessica glared at him. "You were fine being involved last night," she snapped. "And now you're running?" Travis raised his hands defensively. "Hey, I didn't ask to be part of this drama. This is between you and him." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked briskly to his car, leaving Jessica to face the fallout alone. Inside, Ben watched from the window as Travis drove away. He sipped his coffee, his expression calm, the chaos outside a sharp contrast to his quiet triumph. Jessica's pounding on the door slowed, her frantic voice cracking with desperation. "Please, Ben," she called, her tone softer now. "Let me in. I messed up, okay? We can fix this." Ben set his mug down and approached the door, his steps deliberate. He didn't open it, but his voice carried clearly through the barrier. "This isn't about fixing anything, Jessica," he said evenly. "This is about choices. You made yours, and now you can live with them." Jessica's sobs grew louder as Ben turned away, her voice fading into the background. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt liberating. A clean slate waiting to be written upon. He leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee, a small smile forming on his lips. It was over, and for the first time, he was free.